Welcome to this Archives of Iowa Broadcasting Oral History. Our guest today is Gary Dolphin, a Eastern Iowa native, and by his shirt you can tell, a Hawkeye guy. We'll get into his radio and television career today. Cliff Brockman is our producer. I'm Paul Yeager, and I'll be guiding us through this conversation. And Gary, you have to let me ask a couple of questions, okay? I mean, I know you're used to carrying things for hours and hours at a time, but I'll try to interrupt you a little bit here and ask you a couple of questions. First, tell me about growing up in Eastern Iowa.
Well, I grew up in Cascade, Paul. Great to be with you, by the way. And like many kids who grew up in the 50s and 60s, I grew up with an AM radio. You know, I remember when I was, I think, 8 years old, would have been in the late 50s, my parents giving me a little red plastic spin dial RCA transistor radio that I found it fascinating that I could lay in bed at night and just as you know, just twist that dial an eighth of an inch, and there's Ernie Harwell in Detroit doing the Tiger games, the legendary Hall of Fame voice of the Tigers, and then I could twist it a little bit more, and Jack Buck in St. Louis on KMOX, and then a little bit more, and I get Merle Harmon doing the Twins on WCCO in Minneapolis, and then a little bit of a twist, and of course you could always get Brickhouse and Bob Elson, both Hall of Famers, doing the Cubs and the White Sox. So I fell in love with baseball at a really early age. And I thought to myself then, boy, wouldn't that be fun to do? And then in the 60s, it only intensified itself because if you're a kid growing up in Eastern Iowa, very few Iowa football games were on television. There was the game of the week, ABC game of the week with Chris Schenkel, as I remember, Lindsey Nelson, or some of my other heroes, and so I was attached to the hip with WMT radio in Cedar Rapids and WHO in Des Moines, where I could get all those iconic voices, Bob Brooks and Paul Eels, and then later Ron Gonder, and of course Jim Zabel. The unmatched wit of Jim Zabel. And, growing up 60 miles from Kinnick Stadium, it was an easy drive, or Iowa Stadium as it was known then. My parents had season tickets to both Iowa football and basketball. And I can remember 1962, my first visit to Iowa Stadium was Iowa-Notre Dame. And Notre Dame pounded the Hawks pretty good that day, but boy, I was hooked after that. The first basketball game, I with glee tell people, the first live basketball game I ever saw at the old field house was Don Nelson's senior night. And I think he hung 37 on the Wisconsin Badgers. My memory isn't quite as sharp as it was a few years ago. But so that I was hooked. And in my travels, so that convinced me I wanted to be a broadcaster, because I'd look up in the rafters at the field house and see from Frosty Mitchell to Gene Clausen to all the famous names that were allowed to do Iowa games then. Everybody pay a little rights fee, and anybody could do Iowa football and basketball. And ultimately, I ended up at KDTH Radio in Dubuque, and they were one of those originating stations, and did Iowa football and some basketball for 5 or 6 years, then left, got into television for 10 years, and ended up in Chicago doing Northwestern for 6 years and working for the Bears and TV production. And then I got the call in 1996 from the university that said, hey, we're curious as to why you haven't applied for the Iowa job. And at that time, if you remember, Iowa decided to go with an exclusive network, which would ultimately eliminate all these wonderful voices that we've heard through the years. And I just assumed they were going to give it to either Gonder or Brooksy or Jim Zabel, and they decided they couldn't give it to one over the other politically, and but they were going to keep Ed Podolak and Bobby Hansen as analysts. So I jumped in with both feet and was fortunate enough to get the job. And here we are, 27 years later. Going to hang in there for another year or two anyway, and see what happens. But many great memories. But that's how I got hooked on radio. You got to go back to the 50s and 60s and I've always said this, Paul. You've heard me say this. To me, Iowa is still an AM radio state. It's and I mean that seriously, not sarcastically, because we're such a farm-based state, an ag-based state, we hear from farmers in the fields and the barns and the driveways while they're cleaning their equipment, people driving down the interstate on Saturday afternoon or that cold January, February night. And Iowa's unique. It's a unique radio state and will continue to be for many years.
Exactly. Anytime we do basketball or softball championships, Radio Row is most filled when it is the small schools. They are there, and they are from Harlan to Carroll to Dubuque, Manchester, wherever it is. They're broadcasting, and so that's always a history. Let's go back to, of course, baseball is an inspiration, but it's also a way to broadcast. Baseball is different than football and basketball. We'll get into the Hawkeyes again in a moment, but I want to go back to some of your early Dubuque days of radio and television. And did you always think radio was it, or did the bright lights of TV attract you? How did that kind of come about?
It would have been the former because I always wanted to do play-by-play, and I had done some television play-by-play sparingly back in the days when, like as an example, Dubuque Wahlert boys basketball with the legendary Hall of Fame coach Ed Colbert. Seemingly, they were there every year at Vets Auditorium in Des Moines, and so we would fly to Des Moines, tape the game, and then bring it back to Dubuque and tape delay it that night at 10:30. And that's back in the 70s. When you could do that, you pay the High School Athletic Association a rights fee. I was in radio for about 6 years when television, which, being totally honest, was much more financially worthwhile. TV paid more, and I had a young family who just bought our first house. And I thought, you know what? As Frosty Mitchell told me one time, he said, well, look at it this way, Dolph, TV's here to stay. And I took that to heart. I thought, okay, I can always come back to radio. And after 10 years in television, I was very frustrated whereby you would work, and you have more experience at this than I do. You work your tail off all day. And in a market like Dubuque, it's all about local coverage. You can pick up the World Series or the NFL playoffs anywhere. So I always made it an effort to do the local track and field stories or the golf highlights. But you bust your buns all day long to put a lot of good stuff together, and then you've got 3 minutes to get it all in. So I was editing and throwing stuff out as the sportscast went along. That got to be very frustrating. And so when I had the chance to go back to radio, I took it and have never regretted it. So I would say radio has always been at the forefront of what I wanted to do. Because I wanted to be, the next Keith Jackson or Lindsey Nelson was one of my heroes growing up, the old Tennessee Volunteer. And it's, it's a pipe dream, but certainly one that I always felt was attainable. And whether you think the Big Ten or college football and basketball is big time, it's big time to me. And, if you're happy and satisfied with what you're doing and you get to call the games of the team that you grew up loving, the program you love, then to me, I've arrived at my dream job. I tell people it took me 26 years to get my dream job. So be patient. That's first on the list.
Well, hold on. 27 years. That's about what I have, Gary. So you said 2 more years. Okay. Let's just do that. just hypothetical here. Northwestern comes. Did they call you? Did you call them? How did you get that job?
They did. That's an interesting story. I'm glad you asked. I was working in Dubuque at a television station there, the old ABC affiliate, KDUB. And again, as you know on TV, when you're in a small market, you're a one-man show. You've got the camera, you've got the microphone, you've got the power pack, and they were the old JVC, 100-pound power packs with the cassette tape in there. So I went up to the local golf course in Dubuque one rainy, brutally cold November afternoon when the Iowa Conference was hosting its cross-country meet. And it was Wartburg, it was Loras, Central, Simpson, the schools, all great institutions. And a young man from Loras who was out of Chicago, at the time a kid named Tom Bay, Boeh, crossed the finish line first. And so I'm running him down. I said, here, son, hold this microphone for you. And he looked at me like I had 4 heads. Like, what is this guy doing here on this kind of a day? So I did an interview with him that I wanted to run that night as the Iowa Conference cross-country champion. And we got done and had never met the young man. And he said, hey, I got to ask you, I'm from Chicago. WBBM or WGN would never be out here covering the North Park College cross-country champ. I said, well, this is Dubuque, Iowa. And I got to know the Tom well because he was an All-American. He left, got his master's degree in sports administration at Illinois after he graduated from Loras. And I get a call from him, I don't know, 10, 12 years later. And he says, hey, Dolph, I was just hired as the associate athletic director at Northwestern in charge of media relations, radio and TV. I need a basketball play-by-play guy. Now, I know you're in Dubuque, but I trust you. And Tom had been involved in the old National Catholic Basketball Tournament that we televised every year out of Five Flags and went across the country on the old Sports Vision TV network when I'd work with guys like Al McGuire and Digger Phelps, and we even got Vitale out one year, and Annie Myers. It was a great tournament, great exposure for me. And Tom said, I can hire anybody here in Chicago, but I wanted to offer it to you first. And my initial reaction was, okay, a chance to get back in the Big Ten. This is 1989-90. And so, Dubuque's a 3-hour drive from Evanston. So I took the opportunity and I did the games for 6 years. I was already working for the Bears at that time in television production. So I'd go in and take all my vacation time, spend most of my weekends in Chicago covering the Bears, working for the Bears and covering Northwestern basketball. But it really proves a point where Bears thought, that's how you build friendships, you build relationships, and you never know where all these young athletes are going to end up. And Tom Bay left Dubuque, got his master's at Illinois, and then went to the University of Maine, where Kirk Ferentz was the first football coach, hired by Kevin White, who went on to AD fame at Notre Dame and Duke and just retired. Kevin was the head of the NCAA President's Commission for Athletic Directors. He could have been a conference commissioner if he wanted. Kevin left Loras to go to Maine. Had struck up a great relationship with Kevin. Hired Tom Bay. Tom comes back to Chicago, his hometown. And obviously, if that phone call had never been made to do Northwestern, Paul, who knows if the University of Iowa would ever come calling.
Well, it allowed you to do Big Ten basketball. I mean, it's one thing to do all those games, and what I'm hearing you say is basically you take any job that you can because you don't know how it's going to lead, but the opportunities that Dubuque had for you, you did everything that Dubuque had. Then you have the Bears connection and Chicago and Northwestern, and you're doing games at the time when did it matter to you that they were reading books in the stands at Northwestern? It was a chance to be in the Big Ten, I would imagine.
No question. And Tom Davis was coaching at Iowa at that time. And I knew Tom from covering Iowa back in the 80s, of course. And so it was a great way to rekindle relationships or conversations with a lot of the head coaches that were already in the league when I was doing Northwestern, like Tom Izzo and Bo Ryan at Wisconsin. And, of course, most of the play-by-play guys I knew around the Big Ten, including our buddy Mike Grimm, who's now the voice of the Minnesota Golden Gophers, the pride of Delaware County,
Yes.
Manchester, Iowa. And I got a good Mike Grimm story on in that very vein. Mike was doing Iowa women's basketball on WMT in Cedar Rapids at the time. And I get a call from Mike one time, and he was sports anchoring at MT, which, is a 100-year-old station, one of the famous call letters in the country. Excuse me. And Mike called one day, said, "Hey, Dolph, I got a question for you. I'm really at a crossroads." I go, "What's that, Mike?" He said, "Well, I got a job offer, and I just don't know. I love doing play-by-play, and I want to do play-by-play, but I got a pretty good job offer, and I need some advice." I go, "Where's the job offer?" He goes, "KMOX in St. Louis." I go, "What decision is there to make? God bless WMT, but this is KMOX. This is the home of the Cardinals. Jack Buck." I said, "Mike, is there any play-by-play?" "No, but there's a possibility." I said, you got to take that job, period, because that's going to lead to much more than what you envision right now. And Iowa kid moving to St. Louis, yeah, that takes some thought processes, and he made the jump. He ended up hosting a Sunday night NASCAR show with Rusty Wallace, who's from St. Louis. He ended up doing play-by-play at SLU, St. Louis University. And ultimately, when the Minnesota job opened up, I made the call to Learfield. I said, "Look, you got to hire this guy. He's really good." And Mike's been at Minnesota as the voice of the Gophers now, football and basketball, for, oh gosh, he's got to have been there 15 to 20 years. And so, you help people along the way as you can. And but I every time I see him, I said, "Hey, you still regret making that move to KMOX, one of the great 50,000 watt stations in America?" No, that was a good call on your part, he said. So here we are today. But yeah, no, you rekindle those relationships, and it's been wonderful to do that, because otherwise you don't see these guys other than once a year, twice a year if you have a double play.
You mentioned phone calls. The Iowa job, I remember, you talked about the farm kids, farm people, whoever, listening to the radio. I can recall listening to Iowa football in 1985, and it was a magical year. And that Michigan game, I'm listening to Zabel or Brooks. I assume it was Zabel I was listening to. And I knew the game was getting close. So, yes, I somehow figured out a way to get back to the home place and see the finish on TV. But radio is what kept me occupied for many Saturdays. You talked about being in the combines on a fall afternoon, or maybe by the fireplace on a winter night. Knowing that you have that connection with people, what is it that you're trying to do as a broadcaster during those games?
Well, there's the old line, try to paint a picture. In between radio and TV and back to radio, I spent 30 years in banking. And banking taught me, hey, there's something out there other than sports. I mean, it's a big, beautiful business world as well. And in banking, I was in business development, and I just knocked on doors and tried to get business for the bank. And it taught me so many valuable lessons that, you can still be a sports broadcaster, but you need to know that, the presidential election, where's that at if you want to talk politics, which I really don't a lot on the air. But it helps to know what else is going on in the world. And you can intertwine that in your broadcasts throughout the day and make it a complete package, in my view. So that's the first thing that I learned. And radio allows you the time to do that between plays, or between pitches, or during rain delays if you're doing baseball games. And I always felt that helped my broadcasting abilities. And, Ed Podolak, who is finished as an analyst, concluded his great career as an analyst for us on the Hawkeye Network. Ed has a business degree from Iowa, and he's gone on and owned several companies and done many, many projects. And, people who might be in the same line of work, they love hearing about that when they're driving down Interstate 80 or going to a flea market on Saturday morning, getting ready for Iowa football. And that is so Iowa. We're such an agricultural state. And we talk a lot of ag stuff on the air, too, because we have a lot of ag advertisers. And I'm able to know a little piece about every advertising entity that broadcasts on our Hawkeye football or basketball games, and we're always talking about them. Or I know Paul Yeager, and he runs the local Monsanto shop in Belmont or someplace, and that makes for a whole package. Obviously, the main entree is the game itself and what's going on there and what happened this week leading up to the game. But I've gotten so many comments back over the years about, hey, we heard you talking about XYZ the other day, Wall Street, and what's going on in the farm industry, the ag industry. And as you know, if you listen, I know you do, we have a lot of game day sponsors that we get on the air and talk about their business as well, whether it's in Des Moines or Decorah or Coon Rapids or Shenandoah. I just think that's part of the very fabric of what we do in Iowa radio.
And it's the University of Iowa, and America needs farmers. So
A&F
is the long term. And, I work with so many Iowa State alums, and one of them has a plate that says AHF, actually helping farmers, because he's an Iowa State fan. But we'll get it. I'll ask you about the rivalry in a moment. You've only known one football coach at the University of Iowa in your current role. You had the end of Hayden, and then this new guy, Kirk Ferentz, that you mentioned. He comes from Maine. He'd been at the university. What's that relationship like for you? Because you will have to walk a fine line of, I assume you still fly with the team, and you are in, and I've understood the university, at least the Iowa football team is like most. You're a part of the family, but you're also still the guy who has to be objective on the air. How do you walk that line with Coach Ferentz or any coach when you have conversations like you have for 25 plus years?
Yeah, it really hasn't been that difficult, and I've always had a habit, fortunately I haven't had many new jobs, but when I got the Iowa job, I sat down with Hayden, Eddie and I both did, and said, look, Coach, if we're and I did the last 2 years of Hayden's run at Iowa. Of course, knew him for many years, covering his teams on TV and radio prior to that, but not play by play. And now, when you're the voice of the Hawkeyes, you want to have a face to face with the coach, and what's allowable, and where do you draw the line in the sand. And I said to both Coach Fry and to Coach Ferentz, I said, look, if we're playing like doggy doo doo, the listener or the viewer is going to know it. I said, where are the boundary lines? How critical, how critiquing can we get? And Hayden and Kirk almost said the same thing. If we're playing like, go ahead and tell your audience that we're playing like, or by position group, if the offensive line is having a rough day, or the secondary's had 8 touchdowns thrown over the top of it, which I say that facetiously because that hasn't happened at Iowa. But don't get personal, and we would never single out a kid by name. Now, I mean, if Cade McMahon or Spencer Petras or Deacon the Beacon Hill is having a bad day, they understand when they're the focal point, when they're the most important position on the field, your name is on the screen or on the air all day long. And if you're 2 for 16 at quarterback, your name's going to get mentioned and you're having a rough day. But we're never going to get personal or get overly critical of a kid's performance because, well, up until now, they were there on scholarship only. Now it could change with NIL. It's pay for play. Let's be honest, but I would not do that. Nor would Ed, nor would Pat Anger. Now, I remember at Penn State last year when the rain is pounding down and Cade McMahon had a number of turnovers there through 3 quarters, and we couldn't run the ball a lick. I remember Ed Podolak saying out of one break, he said, "Buddy boy, this offense, there's nobody on this offensive line that could block me tonight." And I said, "Well, okay, why is that?" He said, "Well, first off, I'm 77 years old." And but that was Ed's sense of humor with a little critiquing going on. That now, I as I recall, I reminded him, "Yeah, we got 2 guys out with injuries, and you can use injuries to a certain degree, but you're not going to fool the public. They're smart. Those that follow Iowa football, they know that the defense is king, and Torrey Taylor is all world in punting the football, and that our offense needs help. And it was a long struggle last year, and hard not to be critical of the offense. And when you have a world-class defense that could maybe have gotten you in the college football playoffs and might this year as good as it's going to be. So, I mean, there's a fine line there, but both Kirk and Hayden are, they're old school, Paul, or we're old school. They understand you're on the air, you have a job to do, and it's not going to be roses every weekend.
And there are times when you are navigating a call-in show and some coaches, I'm not saying that that's your current situation, they get a little uneasy when they talk to the public because you are varnished and professional in how you critique. But Tommy and Urbandale might not be.
No, and I know there are some coaches shows that still take phone calls. We do not and have not, and that was a Learfield decision. And I pushed back on that originally because I look, these are our ticket buying public faithful, the ones that are there through. My first job, my first year doing Iowa football out of Dubuque was the 0-11 year, which happened to be Frank Lauteber's last year. And I mentioned that in 2015 when the Hawks went 12-0 with CJ and Kittle, and to Eddie that, man, we've come full circle, buddy boy. We've come from 0-11 to 12-0. Now, Ed was in the NFL for the 0-11 season, but you pull for your team. You try not to be too much of a homer. There are days where you have to, you're just kicking somebody and you're shouting with glee to the clouds. Man, what a performance by our Hawkeyes today. But as for the radio shows, we do take text message or tweets, Twitter, and Facebook. And those same people that would be calling in who were very upset for a year or two that they couldn't hear themselves on the radio, and that's part of it too. Everybody wants to be seen on TV or heard on the radio, Paul, and but they've grown accustomed now, and so we where we used to get almost Zippo in terms single digits in terms of tweets or Facebook posts. We're probably getting 20 to 30 to 40 across a 90-minute venue. And, it takes time to answer all those questions. And if they're generic, we save them to the following week. And, of course, that can all change when it's live radio, as you know. But, yeah, the fans, I try to give the fans a voice on that Wednesday night show with Coach or the Monday night show with Coach McCaffrey. But now Coach McCaffrey's a different animal. I mean, he takes offense to anything that's biting, any question or comment that's biting, because he's overly protective of his players. And Fran played the game at the highest level, Division I, and I get that. Kirk is a little bit more lenient and has a more diplomatic answer to everything. I know, excuse me, I know what questions to throw at Fran and what not to. And so that's how we live. We kind of, punch, juke step, move, and keep going through 90 minutes. 90 minutes is an eternity for a radio show. Everybody else in the country goes 60. Well. Yeah. But you know what? We have advertisers that want a piece of that show, and that's fine with me.
Well, you and Fran McCaffrey have a little history, and there's been some parts where you've watched games, not called games.
Twice, as a matter of fact.
How does that relationship then repair and move on?
Well, my relationship with Fran is a great one. Coach McCaffrey, first off, of course, it's been great with Coach Ferentz all along. If Coach Ferentz has had a problem, and he's made a few phone calls to my house over the years. Hey, just clarify what you meant about, and I'm happy to do that. With Fran or with Iowa basketball, of course, I got caught on a hot mic the first time around. And that's on me, or that's on my engineer, who I never blamed once for not cutting a microphone when I had thrown it to a break and thought we were off the air. So that's a lesson learned for Bobby Hansen and I when I was critical of our guard play on the air. I can't remember the date or who we were playing, but so that cost me several games. And after our sit down with Gary Barta, the AD at the time, and Fran, we came to an agreement that that wouldn't happen again, and it hadn't. The second time, I used a description of a great player at the University of Maryland, Bruno Fernando, who rallied Maryland in the last 2.5 minutes with shot blocks and tip back dunks, and I think scored 7 or 9 points himself on 3 or 4 offensive rebounds and 3 or 4 block shots. And called him or compared him to a fictional movie character from way back. My vision there was this animal standing on top of the Empire State Building, swatting airplanes out of the sky, and I guess the short answer meant it to be extremely complimentary. It wasn't taken that way, and so I lost the rest of the season, which was about 7 or 8 games, including the Big Ten tournament, which was very hurtful to me. Had another sit down with Gary Barta, the athletic director, and we worked our way through it. Fran was very diplomatic and listening to my answer as to why I said what I said. He disagreed with it and said, Dolph, you can't say that today. And I go, well, Coach, I know that now, but it wasn't certainly anything intentional. And so I had the support of the administration and ultimately regained the trust of Fran McCaffrey. And I didn't regain the trust of everybody. There were many voices out there thought I should have been fired on the spot, and there are many broadcasters since who have been. Their comments might have been a little more egregious than mine, but it's as you know, Paul, when you're doing play-by-play, and by the way, this was on the post-game show when we were wrapping up the evening's work, but it doesn't matter. You're not going off a prepared script. You're saying what you're thinking, and I've used Spider-Man for great rebounders, and Superman, he's got an S on his chest. And so I've got to, I've learned to be very careful with how I describe great athletic performances. And it's worked out. I've been doing this for 52 years, and I've certainly made my share of mistakes. But at least to this point, none of them from a broadcasting career fatal.
We'll get to your future in a moment and just how much longer you want to add to that 52. But I want to ask memorable calls, memorable road trips, not necessarily tied to success of the team, but from a broadcast perspective. Maybe the first time you went to Beaver Stadium or wherever it was to call a game.
Well, certainly I'm partial to Kinnick Stadium or Carver Hawkeye Arena if you're talking basketball. Football's a different animal. I mean, you've got these 110-year-old stadiums that have been on our TV screens or on our broadcast airwaves for almost that many years. And Kinnick is my favorite simply because most stadiums had a 6 or 8 lane track around the playing field when they were built, just to save economically, save some dollars. God bless the people that designed Kinnick Stadium, because there was never a track around Kinnick Stadium, and that's why the fans are so close to the sidelines and right on top of the play. And they were careful when they renovated Kinnick Stadium to keep it that way. Maybe they're moved back or down deeper a little bit, but it's still. I mean, you've been there, Paul. You know what I'm talking about. A Saturday afternoon or a Saturday evening blackout game at Kinnick Stadium, there's just nothing to match. My favorite road stadium would be the Horseshoe, with all due respect to Camp Randall in Madison, which is a phenomenal place, especially when they do the jump around at the end of the third quarter and the press box is shaking and vibrating. But the Horseshoe is special. It's cantilevered. That third tier roof comes out over the field. So when you got 110,000 people in there and they're screaming, that noise goes up and hits that undercarriage of that roof and comes back down on top of the players and on top of the broadcasters and the fans. It is Goosebump City. All of the facilities are phenomenal from a broadcast standpoint, because you have great lines of vision to the field. Now in Columbus, you're probably 10 stories up and 100 feet back further than we were when prior to their renovation of the Horseshoe. But it's still a great venue to call a game from. Penn State, it's more like an NFL press box. You're a little closer to the field. 115,000 there on whiteout Saturday. There's nothing to compare to that at Penn State, and and what Paterno built there is legendary and carries on today. Continues to be the East program, if you will. Memorial Stadium in Lincoln is another great venue. I always wanted to do a game at Nebraska, and got 80, 90,000 people in there. It's special. They're all special, really.
Yeah.
If you want a favorite.
Now you get to add the West Coast games where the Rose Bowl and the LA Coliseum become conference games.
Unbelievable. I mean, I've seen the landscape change a couple different expansions now, and I'm a throwback. I'm old school. I like the way it was, the original Big Ten, and playing in the Rose Bowl every New Year's Day. But it's exciting now with what we have with the expanded college football playoff system. And, the Hawks, they have a legitimate shot now, but you got to win games. The divisions are gone now, so winning the division doesn't mean anything anymore. You got to win football games, and that's why you'll see these non-conference schedules toughen up significantly. Iowa opens with Illinois State this year, a solid program coached by Brock Spack, who was at Purdue for a number of years in the Missouri Valley Conference. Then you have Troy out of Alabama, a solid program, comes to Iowa City the week after Iowa State. You've got Illinois State, the Cyclones, and then Troy. That's the non-conference schedule. And then they jump right into that Big Ten schedule. And we go to the Rose Bowl for a Friday night game to play UCLA. That'll be different. The University of Washington comes to Iowa City to play the Hawks. The same Washington team that was in the national championship game with Michigan a year ago or last January. And they lost a lot of tremendous players. Roma Dunze, most notably the wide receiver off that team, and obviously Michael Pennick, the number one draft Pennick, the number one draft pick of the Atlanta Falcons. But they brought in a kid from Mississippi State who's a Heisman favorite, who's thrown for 14,000 yards and 115 touchdowns. So Washington just reloads. They've got, I think, 17 transfer portal kids, and they're one's from UCLA, one's from Ole Miss, one's from Mississippi State, even a couple from the Big Ten. They've got a former linebacker at Iowa on their roster who plans to play a lot. So it is the times we live in. It's all about the TV dollars, which is funding a majority of what the athletes will be receiving one way or another through scholarships, NIL, and I'm fine with that. I mean, they deserve a paycheck for all these wonderful TV ratings, and obviously radio ratings should be at an all-time high.
Now we go from the money was passed in brown bags to now it's passed in clear bags. Is that how that works?
It's amazing, isn't it? Yeah, it's.
What has that done for? What has that done for college sports and in the landscape that you work? Seeing how money has changed things, and now you have national conferences, and those lights are bright and the checks are big. Is that still good for college sports?
It is, as long as those TV contracts keep getting renewed. I mean, what did CBS pay over $1 billion for? I forget the number of years, a lengthy contract just for March Madness, not for the rest of the $1 billion just for those 3 weeks of craziness in March. That is college basketball. ESPN has Disney has thrown out a ton of money now to tie up women's college basketball for the next umpteen years. And to that, we owe Caitlin Clark and the Iowa women a debt of gratitude, because Caitlin has really put college basketball on her shoulder blades, and now we'll do it for the WNBA. I was just reading this morning in the paper about the new WNBA contract, where the WNBA will go from, I don't know, $30-40 million a year in TV revenue to upwards of $200 million. It's crazy, the numbers that TV is providing college athletics, and to a certain extent professional athletics. I mean, look at the NFL. I mean, you just start with the NFL. Everybody wants to look like the NFL and the NBA, where the two major sports, basketball and football, are concerned. And we're getting closer to that as time progresses. And so it's great for the athletes. It's great for the exposure for the universities. You know, my frustration is that you have the NCAA here and the universities here, the college presidents and chancellors, and they're getting closer to putting in some boundary lines. Okay, if we're going to pay the quarterback $400,000, how can we only pay the guy that's keeping him on his feet, the right guard, $25,000 or $50,000 or $100,000, whatever the number is? Now they're getting closer to forming a more uniform plan that treats everybody fair and equal. I'm not saying the right guard deserves what the quarterback gets, or the star wide receiver, but it needs to be more equitable, and the same thing for women's athletics too.
You've spent time in banking. It's what the market will bear. That's
no question.
That's what
no question. And now you've got 7 or 8 TV networks that all want a piece of the pie. They all want a seat at the table. So long as that lasts, there's great days ahead for all sports.
Speaking of money, and Jim Zabel and Gary Dolphin. Jim Zabel is famous, the story goes. The check comes, Zabel's nowhere to be found. When Gary Dolphin's out with his radio crew on the road and the check comes, where's Gary Dolphin?
I'm usually there with my credit card out, because I understand the value of your analyst, of your producer, your engineer, your spotter, and now I'm going to tell you, I don't dig that credit card out every week. Not at the price of a steak. You know more about that with the commodity prices on the dinner table, what they are. So I'm a little bit more stringent on the social budget, especially when we're on the road. But you know what? Our guys work their tails off. We have 4 or 5 people in the booth on Saturday afternoon. It's not just me and Eddie or me and Pat Anger. and those guys bust their buns to put a good product on the air. And we got paper flying all around, plugging our sponsors, and I've got a great staff to keep me on the straight and narrow. And you can watch it on
there's air traffic control going on.
Yeah. If you don't believe me, we got our own YouTube channel now. You can watch the broadcast booth on Saturday afternoon. We the numbers came back. We had like 183,000 people during last football season. That we don't do it for basketball for obvious reasons. But I'm thinking, shaking my head, and I've asked a couple people who mentioned they watched the. I said, what compels you to watch Podolak and I do? Oh, it's unique. It's it's amazing what goes on in that booth. You're moving all over with your binoculars and heads up. And I said, well, okay. I mean, it can be entertainment. I said, but we got to watch the hand gestures now. We got to be careful with how we communicate to each other, or I don't need another suspension.
Says guard play, the left guard down. You can't do that anymore. New analyst with Pat Yeager this year.
Yes.
You still look at Bobby Hansen. What's Gary Dolphin's future here? What are you thinking?
Well, I had so much fun with Ed over the years, and hopefully we'll continue that with our pregame visit on game day. And when we had some wonderful applicants to replace Ed, both defensively, offensively. We had special teams, famous names out of the past were interested. So that was heartwarming. The guys that want to be involved with our broadcast. In the end, one of my strong criteria was, the Hawkeye defense has been so doggone good forever that maybe we ought to look toward a defensive player. Well, who better than Pat Yeager? I mean, first team All-American, led Iowa in tackles seemingly his entire career. Great career with the Colts in Indianapolis. Was either second or third in the NFL, a couple years in total tackles. He's out there playing with Bob Sanders and Dallas Clark. Their paths cross. So and Pat, he's a little blue collar. He's a redneck blue collar. He played the game that way. He's got a lot of qualities that Ed Podolak had. And he's a great ad-libber. He's funny. Now we might have to muzzle him a little bit because as a middle linebacker, I think of Dick Butkus and how Butkus would put his cleat right on your hand if it was on the ground and tell you how much he enjoyed squashing you. Pat played the game that way, and I think the listening audience will love Pat Yeager. As for how long I want to do this, well, I certainly can't leave Pat hanging after a year. But I'm 73. I just turned 73. And I've got 3 grandkids, and it's not that I have other priorities that supersede Iowa football and basketball, but it's physically, particularly basketball, where you got 30 some games and half of them are road trips, and most of them are in the middle of the night in January and February. That's starting to take a little bit of a physical toll, mentally and physically, on me, but I still love doing it. And I see myself doing this, health permitting, for at least 2 or 3 more years, and when I get to 75, that's probably going to be enough. We'll see where we're at that crossroads.
You don't have to keep going to Piscataway on a Tuesday night and get back at 5 a.m. back home.
I love College Park and Piscataway and Lincoln on a cold February night. What I will miss when that day comes is just the friendships you build among the players every 3-4 years. Although with the transfer portal, it might be a one and done. But especially the coaches. I mean, coaches are such a unique, rare breed. They're worth every penny they're paid because, number one, they deserve it. They put a great product on the floor of the field. And you can't beat the Big Ten, Paul. It's just the best for academics, for athletics, for exposure, and for developing quality kids.
Gary, what is going to be the lead sentence in your biography? What do you want it to be?
Oh, man, I've never been asked that question, Paul. That's a great question. Something, along the lines, the reason I think I tripped and luckily got into this business is because of the passion I had growing up in small town Iowa for radio. And for the Hawkeyes, 60 miles, Cascade, 60 miles from Iowa City. So it would probably be along the lines of small town Iowa kid, farming community kid makes good in the broadcast booth. That's pretty corny, but after all, corn is our number one product here in Iowa. With all due respect to pork farmers.
Which also was a sponsor. And I earlier when you were saying about the agriculture sponsors, I did want to chime in and say I do know it's the Case IH Red Zone. I mean, I hear you.
Good boy. I'm impressed. You're a busy man. I'm glad you can tune in. You've been in radio and TV, and you learn to hear one thing with, you learn to listen to the game with one ear and know what's going on around you with the other. Multitask.
Well, do you, I guess John Walters, I listen to John, and The Godfather's his own wonderful broadcaster in his own right, but there are both Iowa and Iowa State fans that tell me they can tell what the score is by listening to you guys, just like they used to be able to with Pete Taylor. Do you think that's true?
I absolutely think that's true. I mean, look, we're John's a good friend. Pete Taylor was a great friend. I know Eric Heft obviously very well at Iowa State. I always like to stick my chest out and up until this year say I got to be the only Division I play-by-play guy. As you know, there's 130 some football teams at Division I, and maybe 330 or 50 basketball teams. I don't know of another play-by-play guy that had a Super Bowl champion for a football analyst and an NBA champion for a basketball analyst, and both were great athletes at Iowa. So I'm privileged. I just try to stay out of Eddie and Bobby's way. And I'll do the same with Pat Anger, because play-by-play, I tell you what happened, they tell you why it happened. And so we've always developed a great chemistry, as does the Iowa State crew, as did Gary Rima for so many years at UNI, and the guys at Drake also. And it's a labor of love. And, at the end of the day, it's a game. It's over. Let's move on to next week. And Iowa State, I will tell you, when you lose to the Cyclones, it takes a little bit longer to digest, to put it away and move on. But I try to live by the 24-hour rule. Kirk Ferentz always says, look, you don't want one loss to turn into two. So if you get beat, you move on. Sunday morning, you review the tape, then you flush it, and you look to the next opponent. Because, and I love Coach Ferentz, he's so pragmatic and practical. He always says, look, you only get 12 of these opportunities every year, only 12 Saturdays. So he tells his guy, give me your undivided attention for the next 12 weeks, and we'll do some special things here. And so I've always taken that into the broadcast booth. Be your very level best, be prepared, give your heart and soul for the next 12 weeks with a couple bye weeks sprinkled in. And people are going to enjoy listening to you. And don't make it all about the game. Like I said, with my banking career, and talk about the events of the day, talk about the election coming up November 4th. Obviously you can't favor this party or that, but I think people get a kick out of that. It's more of an entertainment venue than just a sports play-by-play.
Well, thank you for your time, for entertaining us and educating us here about some of the roles from Cascade to Kinnick. He's Gary Dolphin, voice of the Iowa Hawkeyes. Thank you, Gary.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Paul. Great to catch up with you.
And this has been an oral history of the Archives of Iowa Broadcasting. My name is Paul Yeager. Cliff Brockman is our producer. Today's date is July the 25th, 2024. Thank you so very much for watching our oral histories.